Well, welcome. Welcome to Regent College for the launch of Bruce Hindmarsh's co-authored new book, Amazing Grace, The Life of John Newton and the Surprising Story Behind His Song. My name is Cindy Alders, and I will be your host today. I have two roles at Regent. I'm the library director. I'm also a professor of history and formerly a student of Bruce's. Tonight's format is Bruce is going to come and speak to us in a moment. He's going to lecture for a while, and after that, we're going to have time for a Q&A, so you might want to be thinking about any questions you want to ask Bruce while he's speaking, and if you do have a question you want to ask, please come to one of the microphones in the aisles of the chapel here. Immediately following the lecture, the Regent Bookstore will be hosting a book signing, and I would recommend that to you. I've read the book, and it is a ripping good yarn. I devoured it in 2 sittings. And an announcement also from the bookstore. On Saturday, there is going to be another event here in the chapel. It is Bible Saturday, and Ian Proven is going to come back to Regent to speak on the topic of All Creatures Great and Small, the Psalms Global Perspective. And that starts here at 9:30. It's free of charge, but you might want to consider supporting the bookstore by buying a book, perhaps Bruce's new book. Our speaker tonight is my colleague and friend, Dr. Bruce Hindmarsh, who is the James M. Houston Professor of Spiritual Theology and Professor of the History of Christianity here at Regent College. Bruce is the author of several books, John Newton and the English Evangelical Tradition, the Evangelical Conversion Narrative, and the Spirit of Early Evangelicalism, and now he is the co-author of Amazing Grace, this excellent book right here. So please join me in welcoming Bruce.
Thank you, Cindy, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for coming out this evening or joining us on the live stream. And book launch sounds like a funny idea, right? It's almost like there needs to be a catapult or something to launch this book and send it off. I thought this evening what I would do is give a 4-part introduction to the book. And so it's not so much an academic lecture, sort of wrapping the book in an introduction in 4 parts about the writing of the book, what went into the writing of this book, a little bit about the form of the book, how it found the form that it's in, the occasion of the book, and the message of the book. So that's what we'll look at this evening. So first of all, the writing of the book. So Craig Borlase and I have written a book about the life of John Newton, the author of the song Amazing Grace. How did it come to be written? Let's begin 30 years ago. 30 years ago, I finished my DPhil thesis at Oxford, this big weighty thing here, my doctorate at Oxford, and I read a lot of John Newton's mail. My kids used to say that their father reads dead people's mail for a living, and I worked my way through a lot of his archive. It was the subject of my doctorate, and it was a wonderful, massive archive. There were diaries, and there were hundreds of letters, and both sides of the Atlantic, a rich archive at Princeton of diaries, and record offices all over England. Spent a lot of time in the little town of Olney, where he was pastor, and I spoke there last summer, gave an academic lecture for a conference on Amazing Grace, and I reminded them that when I visited 30 years ago, in order to photocopy some of these manuscripts and get copies, I had to get a roll of 10p coins and walk across the street to the ironmonger that had the only photocopier in town to photocopy manuscripts. So it's all a little bit different now. But I kind of worked my way through Newton's archive, and it's a rich archive for exploring a key figure in the early evangelical awakening. So that became this book, that explored John Newton's role in the first generation of the evangelical awakening, the evangelical revival in Britain. And it focused on his ministry, his spiritual theology, his work as a pastor, his hymnody, and a lot had been written about Newton. In every generation there seemed to have been some kind of an inspirational biography, but he was a subject that was waiting to be done in terms of his theology and a pastoral biography of somebody that a later 19th century historian described him as one of the finest pastors of the 18th century. So that was that book, and it did not focus so much on his early life or on his later life, not so much the things that he was most famous for, and not so much his role in abolition, not so much his relationship with the troubled poet William Cowper, some of those things. This focused on his theology, his ministry, his contribution. He also was, he described himself as a sort of middleman, and it meant that through his biography, you could kind of see a lot of what was going on in other people's lives, and through his correspondence. Bill Reimer helped us publish. Just a little bit later, we published the life and spirituality of John Newton. I wrote an introduction for this, and this was his autobiography that he wrote in 1764, when he was about 30 years of age, I guess, just the year he entered ministry, ordained ministry. And also his 3 letters on growth and grace that seemed to me an epitome of evangelical spiritual theology. And my students just read this this week in one of my classes, and where he describes how one grows in grace, not just how one comes to Christ in conversion. I sometimes say it's not just an alpha course, but is there an omega course? Like, where does this thing go? And how do we grow in the Christian life? And it's a nice little compressed summary of spiritual theology. But then we've returned to this book, which began not 30 years ago, but 18 months ago. In mid-October 2021, in the middle of COVID, I had my first conversation with Craig Borlase, my co-author. And the individual who put us together was Charles Morris. He's become a dear friend. He is the executive director, I guess the president and the speaker for Haven Ministries. And he's a great friend of Regent and often involved at Regent, taking courses and no stranger to our community, and goes to St. John's, Vancouver. But he had a heart for this, and he thought this story, John Newton's story, needs to be told for another generation. But his dream was that there could be a film, there could be a documentary. And then along with that came the idea, well, if we're doing a documentary, let's also do a book. So in November, the weekend of the 13th to the 15th of November 2021, various COVID restrictions still happening, a group of people met in our home, not that far from here on 32nd Avenue. Charles was there, and Michael Andrews, who's the music director for All Souls Langham Place in London, as somebody who could be involved in the music. And Reuben Evans, that I'll introduce a little bit later tonight, who as a possible director for the film. And Craig came over from England, and Charles was there. We began to talk about and to kind of storyboard what a possible film could look like. And then Craig and I began to talk about the book. It was going to be the 250-year anniversary of the writing and sort of introduction of the hymn Amazing Grace. And was this a chance to return to the story of John Newton for me after 30 years? Was it a chance to go back to these archives and to retell this story for another generation, to tell all of it, not just now the kind of theology and the ministry, but to reckon with this story, which is quite dramatic and quite remarkable story in terms of his experience. And I would need to revisit with more attention his early life, his later life, and go back to those archives. So this is where I met Craig Borlase. He's traveling right now in Australia with 2 of his daughters. I wish he could be here, and I wish you could meet him. And Craig, if you're listening to the live stream, hi, Craig, and miss you. But Craig flew over. He lives just south of Oxford, and he had worked with Charles on a book. And Craig, okay, I write a book like about once every 10 years, and I think Craig has written like 50 books. He is remarkably fluent. Some of them are New York Times bestsellers, and he's come to focus especially on memoirs. And he's really gifted at, I've never met somebody who listens like Craig listens. And he'll listen to somebody, he'll listen to them for a weekend, he'll record their story, and he'll see where the story is in there. What's the drama? And he'll work with people on writing memoirs. And so he's written all sorts of books, and he's a very, very gifted writer. So the weekend he was here was, do you remember this weekend? That was the weekend, right? And being a kind of oblivious academic, I didn't realize this was happening. This was when, you know, all the roads got wiped out. There's an atmospheric river. Vancouver is isolated, and the Fraser Valley is flooded. And we're just talking about John Newton and Amazing Grace. And I take Craig for a walk in Pacific Spirit Park with their dog. And I'm thinking, it's kind of windy. And we're hearing kind of trees falling behind us, hearing the crack, and we're having to kind of walk on logs across creeks, but we're sharing our lives together, getting to know one another, and talking about what this book might look like. We came back and explained to our wives how, you know, lesser men might not have survived and so on, and about this great adventure we had. But really, that was, I think, a time when we bonded as we shared more of our lives together and what our hopes might be for this book. And Craig has become a heart friend. And if nothing came of the book, I'm just grateful for having made a friend. So we began to storyboard, right? And to look through, this is just a screen grab of a kind of presentation that we kind of work through. And there's kind of a U-shaped pattern to the drama of Newton's life. We began to storyboard. There were many dangers, toils, and snares in Newton's life. There were reckless decisions and a reckless love affair. There's trauma, there's kidnapping, there's near shipwreck, near starvation, near-death illness. He was himself enslaved, and he became a slave trader. But by the end, he was a transformed man. He was genuinely transformed. He was a wise spiritual counselor, widely regarded and appealed to by many. He was a powerful preacher who saw awakening in his area, in his region, in his community, and he became a courageous abolitionist. How could we tell this story today? There's a sense that it was a kind of U-shaped story. It's all there, and one of the things Craig initially, he thought, I don't know if I want to write a story about a song. Like, is there a story there? Like, that sounds pretty boring. Or he'd never worked on dead people. Like, he writes living memoirs of living people. And so we were talking about this, but we realized there is so much drama in this story, so much there to be told. And also, there's a kind of series of arcs, narrative arcs that work like an echo. There's what we call the Mary Catlett arc in terms of the love story. There's a love story between he and Mary Catlett, and and he nearly lost her, and then and ends up marrying the woman who really genuinely is the love of his life, and it's a wonderful story, but it is a kind of U-shaped story itself. There is the arc of Newton's story and his descent into humiliation and his descent into iniquity and return. But there is also a kind of racial redemption arc as he sort of sinks into the slave trade, and he sinks into the belly of the beast and eventually finds his way out and is involved in overturning that system. But ultimately, there is an amazing grace arc. The book is, Craig and I have often said the book is entitled Amazing Grace, not Amazing John Newton. And it really is the deepest story, and this is the story we hoped could be told for another generation. I mean, in what his story writ small is the biblical story of creation, fall, redemption, new creation, childhood innocence, descent into hardness of heart, conversion and growth in grace, this kind of redemption This is the kind of pattern of many conversion narratives in history, and it's the genuine pattern of his story. It's not something we had to impose on it. It's there, and we want to be able to capture some of that redemptive arc. So that some of went into deciding to write the book, deciding to go back into the archives and do the research. What about the form of the book? We chose to write this book to read like a novel, to tell John Newton's dramatic story vividly from the inside, and to try to tell it as a parable in which we can all find ourselves, as a parable of God's grace. The challenge was to show, not tell. The historian usually tells, and I usually can't write half a sentence without a footnote, you know? And I'm working with somebody who's very creative, and he wants to feel the story, see the tension, and just imagine his way into the story. So how is this going to work? It forced me in a different way to get inside John Newton, to adopt his point of view, to feel what it might have been like for a 6-year-old boy to suddenly lose his mother while his father is away at sea. To really think about that. Craig helped me be a better historian. To feel what it might have been like for a reckless teenager to be suddenly kidnapped and forced into the Navy. To feel how punch-drunk in love he was with Mary Catlett, that 3 times in a row, 3 years in a row in December, he could not pull himself away from her family, and he got into trouble with his father, and he got into trouble with the Navy 3 years in a row. To feel the depth of his despair at 21 years of age when all hope was lost, and he nearly died in a malarial fever, unloved, far from home, in Africa. There was so much of that that I needed to learn to feel my way into the story. There were a lot of facts to check and to get right, a number of errors that have crept into the historical record over the years. And so even while trying to tell this story from the point of view of the characters in the story, we tried to correct the historical record as we went. So there is a ship that was named wrong. People have called it the Pegasus. It was the Levant. The captain was named as John Penrose. It's actually James Phelps. The slave trader to whom Newton was apprenticed on Plantain Island has been called Amos Clow for 30, 40 years, but in fact it's a man named Evans. There's a new manuscript of Newton's autobiography at the Morgan Library in New York that names the man, and so on. So we just quietly, so even though there's a lot that's sort of imagined in the telling of this story, there's a lot that is actually getting things right as the best we can historically. It was a challenge to keep Newton's point of view and write this in a way that the reader would be immersed in the story, like having a front row seat in theater or like a film, but to discipline ourselves to stick as close as we could to the record, sailing close-hauled, as Newton might have said. There's an 8-hour time difference, as Craig wrote in England and me in Canada, but we turned this to our advantage, working in shifts. The metaphor we used is I would sous chef material for him late in the afternoon or evening while he was sleeping. He would wake up and then cook away while I went to bed. Then I would wake up to see what he had done and adjust the recipe, and on we would go. And we sort of worked back and forth in the early months of 2022. This is where he came back in January 2022 and stayed with us. And I drove him up toward Whistler, I think Brandywine Falls, and we stopped at Lions Bay General Store and Coffee Company. And we sat there, showing up there at that picnic table. And this is where we hammered out the conventions. He had begun to write. I'd begun to get a knot in my stomach. How is this going to work? How are we going to get this right? And how would we handle the history and the imagination? And could the writer trust the historian and all the rest of it? Grace Irwin is a relatively famous Christian writer. There's an award named after her, the Grace Irwin Award. And she wrote a book in 1961 that was a fictionalized account of John Newton's life called Servant of Slaves. And all those names that I mentioned that are in the historical record that are wrong, they came out of that fictionalized account of John Newton's life. And so I was determined that we weren't going to do that sort of thing again, that we were going to try to get it right. So how would we adopt Newton's point of view and other figures in the story, write dialogue and narration? Some of the conventions we chose to be exact with proper names. All the proper names are correct. Exact with the documents, exact when we're quoting documents and letters and minutes of meetings and so on, exact with the chronology, but to take more liberty with dialogue, internal dialogue, and scene painting. Obviously, most of the dialogue or when we're narrating internal thoughts of characters, that has to be imagined. That's obvious, right? Nobody's there. But we tried not just to make things up. We tried to use the sources wherever we could, and then to create dialogue, internal dialogue, point of view that would serve the truth, capital T, truth of the story. So, here's an example. When Newton said in his autobiography in 2 different places, he talked about his father, and he said, "I was always in fear when before him." Or again, he said in one of the other manuscripts, "My father had a sternness in his temper which discouraged and overawed my spirit." Right? We wanted to write dialogue between the father and the son, where after reading it, the reader would say, John Newton was overawed in spirit and in fear of his father, as realistically and plausibly as we could. So we did this, for example, after John Newton returns in shame at 16 years of age from a failed appointment in Alicante in Spain, and has to have a difficult conversation with his father. There is some imagined dialogue between the father and the son. So Craig and I had several conversations about that. He said in the end, the metaphor he used was, it was like when we were walking in the woods and your dog would kind of dart off here and dart off there, and every now and then you had to call him back. He said, just do that with me, just call me back. You know, if I wander too far, it's like, come on back. And I want to give you just a feel for this, the form and the style of the book. And I thought I would read a short section from near the end of the story when Newton is a little bit older than me. He's in his 60s. So I don't want to give the whole story away, but I'm going to jump to, he's in his 60s. He's a little bit older than me. And this, for me, is some of the material I found most moving to study again and more deeply and to write about with Craig. Because he's in his 60s and he has to reckon with what he had done in his 20s. And here's a few of the hints, just of some of the dawning of conscience in Newton before I read you a little bit here. He said very early on, he said, like, he didn't think of his conversion as this dramatic conversion and he's changed. He said, no, my first beginnings in a religious course were as faint as can well be imagined. It took him time, grace had to work in his life, he said. And then in his 60s, when he's looking back, he said, this is quite a poignant quotation, custom, example, and interest had blinded my eyes. Just think about that. When it's accepted by everyone, the people you know and respect and that set an example for you are doing it, and it's actually in your self-interest, maybe financially and otherwise, how easy it is to go along with the majority. He recognized that. He said, in quite a poignant letter to the abolitionist Richard Phillips in 1788, I hope God has forgiven me, he said, but I must walk softly all my days in the remembrance of what I have been and what I have done. That's quite the reckoning, isn't it? Again, he said in a really influential tract he wrote against the slave trade, one of the most important pieces of anti-slavery literature in this moment, he said, I am bound in conscience to take shame to myself by a public confession, which, however sincere, comes too late to prevent or repair the misery and mischief to which I have formerly been accessory. I hope it will always be a subject of humiliating reflection to me, that I was once an active instrument in a business at which my heart now shudders. So that's by way of introduction. Let me just read 2 pages to give you a feel for this, the style of the book here. On March 28, 1789, the Reverend John Newton said a quiet goodbye to Mary, checked to make sure that Betsy was quite well, and gently shut the front door behind him. He walked south, passing coffee shops and taverns, down narrow alleys and lanes that were familiar to him now as they were when he was a boy. He paused at church, St. Mary's. His church was perfectly silent inside, and the air was so much colder than it was on the streets. He prayed, breathed in and out, drawing strength for what was to come. Outside again, he continued his journey south, skirting past St. Paul's Cathedral and on toward the Thames. John felt tranquil as he approached the water, even though the river trade was even busier than it had been when he was a boy. People whose lives had begun in Africa or in the Indies, east or west, were no longer thought of as exotic or unusual. They were a part of the fabric of London, a tapestry of race woven by trade. He turned north just before the Palace of Westminster, crossed St. James's Park, and headed for the brick arches of St. James Palace. He was shown to a vast corridor outside one of the staterooms and told to wait. The ceilings were high, and distant noises echoed off the stone walls. He ignored the distractions and carried on praying. With this much at stake, the only thing he could do was rely on God to see him through. Minutes passed, and still John sat in silence. A door opened nearby, and he was aware of his name being called, but he was too lost in prayer to really notice. The voice was closer when it called his name again. He looked up and was immediately startled. "Mr. Pitt," he said, getting to his feet, more than a little flustered. "Prime Minister, I apologize." Pitt held out his hand and shook John's warmly. "Mr. Newton, you're most very welcome here today." John followed the Prime Minister through the heavy doors and into a big room, big enough to house the congregations of both St. Mary's and the church at Olney and still have room for more. There were people there already, a dozen or two, rather than hundreds, gathered behind a row of tables at the far end of the room. Some of them he recognized, some he did not. Every one of them was standing and looking at him. Some were smiling, some were not. John was shown to a chair and a table that had been set apart, facing the crowd. He sat, feeling less like a captain taking charge of his ship and more like a man pressed into service. Not that he was reluctant to be there. He was glad to be able to appear before the Privy Council like this. But like his first hours on the Harwich, he had little idea of what he was about to face. The questions started immediately, and they came one after another like waves crashing against a ship. How long have you been resident on the coast of Africa? In what year or years? In what capacity and in what part? How long have you been in the slave trade? John steadied himself and answered each in turn, as it became clear that he would be cross-examined rigorously like a witness in a courtroom. After explaining that he had lived in Africa for 18 months, commanded 3 slave ships, and left the slave trade for good in 1754, he settled in, answering their questions in detail about local culture, religion, and economic life among the Sherbro people where he had lived and traded. Then the questions pressed deeper, asking what he knew of the treatment of slaves and the moral character of the African people he met on the windward coast. John confessed that he had himself purchased many hundreds of slaves. It was painful to remember. He explained how these slaves were made captives through war, punishment, and kidnapping, and then how they were passed along until they reached the coast. And how, Mr. Newton, did the conditions for these slaves while in Africa compare to their conditions under Europeans? It was many years ago, but he could remember it like yesterday. Let no one be mistaken. The situation of slaves at home is bad, worse on board ships, and worst of all in our islands. What did you think of the character of the various African people you encountered? He drew a deep breath, knowing this was an important question. Too many dismissed Africans as savages. All eyes were on him. The people are gentle, he said clearly, pausing for a moment before adding, when they have no communication with Europeans. It was the slave trade that just made everyone involved incomparably worse. He had done his best. When the report was issued next month, it was 850 pages. And then on May 12th, Wilberforce was back, and armed with evidence, he launched into a closely argued speech of 3.5 hours in the House. The parliamentary campaign had begun. So that's just one section that sort of gives you a feel for some of what, some of the drama of the story. 15 months later, he's back giving testimony before the House Select Committee, and then they printed the notes. And he had his own printed copy of the notes of the testimony he had given, and he signed his name on it, and there's all sorts of marginalia he wrote on it. And at one point, he wrote this, and I found this very moving. He said, this is the manuscript, he said, his handwriting on the printed text. I make no apologies for speaking publicly against this trade. I dare not. Should I be silent, my conscience would speak loudly, knowing what I know. Nor could I expect a blessing on my ministry, though I should speak of the sufferings of Jesus till I was hoarse. And at the bottom, he added this quotation from Genesis 4:10, and the Lord God said, what hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. What a profound reckoning in his 60s. We've talked a little bit, first introduction is to talk a little bit about the writing of the book, how it came to be written, a little bit about the form of the book, a little bit about the occasion of the book. It's an anniversary. It was 250 years ago, on the 1st of January, that a congregation in the market town of Olney in England, where he was a pastor, first sang the hymn Amazing Grace. It did not become popular right away, but gradually it spread among churches and denominations in America, especially in America. It became a revival song on the Western frontier, and African-American spiritual and black churches, and a standard in 20th century hymn books. It then crossed over later into the commercial marketplace in the age of radio, with recording artists like Mahalia Jackson in 1947 and Judy Collins in 1971, and on its popularity went. But here, in 1773, in this church, is where this hymn was written and sung. I don't think John, turned to Polly and said, I think I just wrote a real banger, like this is going to be a real success. It's just another hymn. It was a part of his ministry and a part of helping people sing the gospel into their lives. And when it was published, it was called, it was to the text, 1 Chronicles 17, verses 16 and 17. I'll talk about that in a minute. And it was called Faith's Review and Expectation. I look back and I look forward. New Year's Day. Grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. It's the passing of time. So it's written for on that occasion. 250 years ago, but is there any song today that has gone so wide and quite so deep? I don't know that there is. The way we begin the book in the preface is with some of the stories about Amazing Grace. And here's the way we begin. Swiss Air Flight 111 was en route from New York to Geneva on the evening of September the 2nd, 1998, when it suddenly plummeted 2,400 meters into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Nova Scotia, killing all 229 people on board. The tiny tourist village of Peggy's Cove was immediately transformed into a command center for the police, the Coast Guard, and other emergency officials. Shocked family members arrived to look out over the waves that held their loved ones. Army chaplains went to the water's edge and offered to pray with the grieving family of a 19-year-old California student. The chaplain led them in prayer, and then the family started to sing a hymn in 4-part harmony and followed this with Amazing Grace. The chaplain noticed that all the rescue workers and onlookers were transfixed by the scene. Everyone stopped until they were done. He added, things like that were going on all day. Amazing grace in the midst of incredible sorrow. This song has become popular. It's gone wide, but it's also gone very deep into our consciousness. And of course, it was sung after 9/11, and we did a documentary with the BBC in 2007 where we had some of this footage.
That's the tune.
The sound is not coming through there. Let me try that again.
As soon as the piper strikes up playing Amazing Grace, that's it. I mean, it's people break down at that point.
Is there any other piece like it?
That's the tune.
Of course, at memorials all over America for 9/11, it's Amazing Grace that people wanted to sing. And that's why Mary Rourke has called it, in America, our spiritual national anthem. It's remarkable that it's become really a cry for grace in the midst of inconsolable loss. When the very worst happens, when we can't reckon with the evil that stalks this world, that people want to sing a song that actually is one of gratitude for grace. I think really it's been a cry for grace. Even more remarkable, and I'm going to skip over some of these, is the way in which it passes over into the commercial marketplace and is also sung and cherished as an African-American gospel song. And Mahalia Jackson in 1947. A black poet in Britain last summer explained to me, she said, the reason why it's being sung so slowly is because we're free. We have all the time in the world. It became a civil rights anthem in the 60s. And Judy Collins sang Amazing Grace. It became a folk song. It charted in 1971 in the Billboard Top 40. And Judy Collins remembers this.
Standing here. And I opened my mouth with my friends behind me and sang, Amazing Grace.
The Royal Scots Dragoon Guards in 1972 recorded it on bagpipes, and it charted on the Billboard Top 40 for 8 weeks on bagpipes. People think it's been traditionally done on bagpipes and on state occasions and at state funerals. It's only since 1972 that it's been done on bagpipes. But of course, the Library of Congress has a recording library with over 3,000 recordings of Amazing Grace, and it's one of the most recorded songs ever. Perhaps what brings together the popularity of the song, the kind of ways, the irony that a song that is written by a former slave trader has become an African-American standard. The moment that brings that out most poignantly is probably when Amazing Grace is sung. He said he didn't know he was going to necessarily do this, but at the funeral for the slain pastor, Reverend Clementa Pinckney, at Charleston, South Carolina on June the 26th, 2015.
Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace. Amazing grace.
Quite the moment. Jesse Norman, Aretha Franklin, Wintley Phipps. There's a number of African-American singers in all genres who've sung this hymn and spoken about it. Wintley Phipps said, I believe God wanted that song written just the way it was. He knew it had been written by a former slave trader, just so we would be reminded as Christians, whether black or white, we are all connected by God's amazing grace. It is good to affirm that when evil has done its worst, grace still has the last word. Mercy triumphs over judgment. The sprinkled blood still speaks a word better than the blood of Abel. Back to 250 years ago, this is John Newton's diary. We have the diary when he wrote Amazing Grace and when it was sung at the church New Year's Day. So it would have been the day before, the night before, sitting in his attic. They would have kind of written to him. We have his sermon notes that went along with the sermon that day. And on the same passage, and you can kind of track, it follows the same themes as the hymn. And the hymn is originally written as a paraphrase, not of Newton's experience, though it does speak to his experience, not even in the first instance of the experience of his parishioners, but it's King David's experience in the Old Testament. This is the text. Who am I, O Lord God, and what is mine house that thou hast brought me hitherto? It's when the prophet Nathan comes to David, and David wants to build a house for God, to build his temple. And Nathan comes, no, it's not going to be you. You've got too much blood in your hands. It's going to be your son, Solomon. You're not going to build my house. I'm going to build yours. I'm going to build your dynasty. And it's the Davidic covenant. And it's through this covenant and the greater son of David that this grace comes. And Newton explains and makes these connections in his sermons to David, to us, and so on. It's a powerful kind of powerful moment that it's David in the first instance who says, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Just briefly, this is 250 years ago. We don't know what the music was. There's several recordings. The English Chamber Choir has recorded some of the Moravian tunes that were linked to Amazing Grace. And Marilyn Rouse, a tremendous lay historian in the UK, has dug those up and arranged those. I did find an early case where this is the earliest I could find where it was explicitly linked. And it was in the Countess of Huntingdon's hymn book. So you're wondering, what did Amazing Grace sound like when it, back then, before it found its tune? I had a 16-voice choir sing this.
So sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
It didn't really catch on. I wonder if this is the moment when we could sing it and together. It's strange to talk about the song without singing it. And I've invited my colleague and friend Jens Zimmerman and Catriona Day, who plays cello, and Jens on the piano. Do you guys want to come? And we'll, why don't we sing this together? And we'll sing the original fourth verse. The verse, when we've been there 10,000 years, was added by a hymn book editor in 1910. And he stole it. He stole that verse from a hymn called Jerusalem, Our Happy Home, that had over 70 verses. I think he thought nobody will notice if I take this one and just add it to Amazing Grace. So that's not the original. We'll sing it this way. So do you want to stand and we'll just sing this together? Yeah. We're going to play an intro verse first on the cello and then join in. Thank you. Can you thank these guys for me? Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks. So the writing of the book, the form of the book, the occasion for the book, this song, Amazing Grace, 250 years. And then lastly, and just very briefly, the message of the book. I thought I'd read you just, again, a little bit from just the final pages of the book. Newton was a changed man by the time he wrote his autobiography, and God's grace had made all the difference. In his ministry of some 50 years, we can see the power of the Holy Spirit working through him to change many hearts, to break down barriers between denominations, to build up the church with edifying writings, to nurture the spiritual growth of those training for the ministry, to encourage pioneer missionaries, to found religious societies of lasting influence, to provide apt spiritual counsel in person and by letter, and to extend compassion where others would condemn and judge. His transformed character had been evident for decades, not just at the end of his life. Yet, there was a genuine gentleness, tenderness, and humility that was, if anything, even more profound at the end of his life. As he said to Richard Phillips, remember, he said, "I hope God has forgiven me, but I ought to walk softly all my days in remembrance of what I have been and what I have done." When Newton thought of grace maturing in our lives, his sense was that it tended in this direction, producing a wisdom that is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown by peace by those who make peace. James 3. Grace produces the sort of people, therefore, that are not easily caught up in, as Newton said, a fierce contention for names and notions and parties. In our increasingly polarized world, this is a good reminder that grace can work in us a kind of tenderness of spirit that makes for peace. Mercy triumphs over judgment. In a world of injustice, there's only so far that critique can go before it descends into recrimination, retribution, and revenge. The very universality of the hymn Amazing Grace suggests there is a better way, a deeper well to draw from. As the book of Hebrews said, the sprinkled blood speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. It is the word of God's amazing grace in Christ Jesus. That better word has echoed down the centuries and across the continents in the song that John Newton left us. It continues to speak a better word today. Thank you.
Yes, we were all, really appreciative of what you've shared with us today and for the writing of the book. We have some time for questions now. So if you have one and would like to come up to one of the mics here, we can take them. Maybe just in these moments as we're waiting, could I ask a question?
Sure. Yep.
So your DPhil thesis, right there, 30 years ago, and the new book now. Is he the same John Newton to you now as he was back then?
Oh, that's good. No, I think that's interesting. I think there's a bit of a change. I mean, I remember when I was doing the doctoral thesis and immersed in this, Carolyn would tell me every now and then things like, we don't talk that way anymore, Bruce, because I started to sound too much like the 18th century and John Newton. Or she said John Newton is allowed in the living room, he's allowed in the kitchen, but he's not allowed in the bedroom, and that sort of thing. So, it was immersed in it, and I genuinely found him a deeply attractive figure as a pastor and as a theologian, as a human being. But I don't think I'd reckoned with, I think the way in which my picture of him has changed is a couple ways. One is realizing some of the things that happened to him. I think for many of us, there may be awful things that happen to us for which we need grace. And then there's the ways in which we are complicit and the ways in which we do things for which we need grace, right? But beginning to realize even some of the traumas that he had been through and some of the things he experienced. And then the depth of his remorse, I think, and some of that poignancy that we tried to capture at the end. I think in a sense, my picture of him has it's sort of deepened. It's a deeper picture, right? There's more dimension to the picture. Yeah.
It's great, thank you. And I can, I had somebody, when I was writing my own DPhil thesis, one of my supervisors say to me, you might want to use a more modern diction. So I had somebody calling me out too. Please, go ahead.
I got a three-parter. Where in Africa did he capture the slaves from, and where did he live?
Where did he live in London?
In Africa.
In Africa. It was West Africa, it was Sierra Leone, and it was mostly south of Freetown. When he lived there for about 18 months, it was Plantain Island, a little island near the Sherborough River, where the Kiddam River sort of empties into that. It's about, I'd say, 70 or 100 miles south of Freetown. And when they were slave trading, it was mostly in that Sierra Leone windward coast area, from just north of sort of what became Freetown, and then south, a bit further south of that Kiddam area, but it was mostly concentrated in that area. And it would typically be, when the slave trade was happening, it would typically be small, like lots of sort of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 slaves maybe at a time, and it's as they kind of work down the coast. That's where that happened, yeah.
I was in Luanda last year, and I went to the Slavery Museum, and there was no mention of John Newton there, so I didn't know if he was that far south.
Yeah.
Second question, my wife and I visited a church in Northern Ireland in Londonderry, and we're walking around, big building, and then there's this big plaque out front with John Newton's name all over it. And they claim, I guess everyone wants to claim him now, right? But they claim that he visited there, that was the port that he landed in after the storm.
Yeah.
And can you elaborate on any
It was
significance?
Low Swilly, that's the inlet that they came down, Low Swilly, and so it may be near there. There's a John Newton Park there where the ship, anchored. It didn't land. But where it would have anchored that ship sort of barely made it into port. But it was right near there. Yeah.
Okay. And then my last one is his connection to William Wilberforce.
Yeah.
How many years did they overlap, and how much did John Newton have an impact on the House of Lords in that abolition of slavery?
Quite a bit. So Newton, there was family connections, and Wilberforce, when he was a boy, would have known Newton, and there were sort of connections through Wilberforce's aunt and so on, and he sort of knew of John Newton as kind of like, he thought of him as sort of a childhood pastor that he had kind of connected with. And it's after Wilberforce traveled with Isaac Milner on the continent, and when Wilberforce is going through his own conversion experience in about 1785, that he decides when he comes back, I mean, he's been a long-term kind of MP for Hull, was it? But Wilberforce goes to knock on Newton's door, and because he's in the process of conversion and wondering about his vocation and wondering about politics. And it's kind of something that he kind of walks around the block a couple times, not knowing if he has the courage to knock on the door, right? And to be known to be sort of seen with a reputed Methodist and all the rest of this. But Newton puts him at ease. They have a conversation, and that's beginning of what we might call today a quite significant relationship of spiritual direction with Wilberforce. And he encourages Wilberforce to stay in politics and to be used sort of closer to the throne, in a sense, to do what others were doing elsewhere, and that this is a vocation, and encourages him to go forward in abolition. And Wilberforce's sons said that there was hardly a moment that Newton couldn't talk to Wilberforce, like he was constantly talking to him about the slave trade. Wilberforce encouraged him to give evidence to Privy Council, the House Select Committee. He wrote his tract, and all of this was a vital part where Newton and Wilberforce are collaborating in the beginnings of the parliamentary campaign. And many people think the timing of this, it's quite significant. Newton's testimony is trusted. He's a respected clergyman, and it's very poignant. He's doing this while his wife is dying of cancer. Again, something Craig noticed all the timing of this, that this is happening. He's speaking out. He's taking shame upon himself, and he's giving this testimony. But so it's the closest relationship between the two, and there's all sorts of correspondence between the two, and some of that is in the book. So, yeah.
Jens, please.
Bruce, thank you for the book. I started reading it out of obligation because you gave me a free copy. And then I couldn't put it down. And I did take it into the bedroom. It wasn't a problem. I have lots of questions, but I'm going on historical ones, but I have one that really I'm curious about because I know you did a number of interviews for this book. And I was just wondering if you could name two maybe of the toughest questions you got and how you responded to them.
Great. Great. Trust Jens.
Yep.
Most of the interviews have not been, they've not been hostile, but but people want to explore the questions that are there and are in the culture. And one of the questions would be, one of the very reasonable questions would be, why do we need to hear more about John Newton? Because he was a slave trader. And it's questions about, like, that's why we say it's Amazing Grace, not Amazing John Newton, and that was the first thing he would say. But it's sort of like, should he be canceled? Should he be canceled? And when we wrote the book, we wanted to go right in between Scylla and Charybdis, between sort of cancel culture and whitewashing. We wanted to tell the truth, right? To tell the truth, and this is a redemptive story. I think one of the questions I was prepared to answer that didn't come is, who cares about John Newton? You know, we need to just tell the stories of the Africans. And I think both are true. We need to talk about the gifted musician, former slave, Ignatius Sancho in London. We need to talk more about Olaudah Equiano. We need to talk about James Albert Okausa Graniosa. We need to talk about Phyllis Wheatley. We need to talk about Rebecca Proughton. We need to tell, and these stories thankfully are being told. So I think there's, you know, the present moment is one in which, you know, can you tell a story about a white former slave trader? I think the danger of not telling this story, not being willing to hear this story, is, do we think that John Newton was beyond grace? And do we really, are we so sure that we get grace and other people don't? And I think, so for me it's a matter more that it provokes me to go, what is written in letters too large for me to read in my own life? What is there that I'm not seeing? What am I complicit in? And it makes me just realize the power of majorities to twist the way people think, that it's way more powerful than you think. So it's in that zone, that zone of questions, I think. Yeah.
David, please.
Thanks. Bruce, in writing the book, which historical figure, using the exercise of imagination, was the hardest figure to kind of get inside their head, like to frame the dialogue the way you do in the book? And in particular, I was wondering how difficult William Cooper was.
Yeah. Newton had a loving relationship with his wife, Mary. And it's really nice because there's a lot of really bad evangelical marriages in the 18th century. Some historians call John Wesley's marriage the 30 Years' War, and so on. This was a genuine, loving relationship. And it's nice, like Marilyn Rouse has found we have a little portrait of Mary Newton now. There's a little image at the Cooper Newton Museum and so on. But how could we have Mary Newton come more alive and not just have her story told through other people and so on? So we have one place where we try to adopt her point of view and allow her, in a sense, to be narrated from her point of view. And so that's difficult simply because, as is often the case, there aren't as many sources there to do that. We also wanted there to be a genuine sense of African agency, not simply victims, but agents in their own storytelling and their own emancipation. And so we have one point where Newton in 1772, not long before he writes Amazing Grace, meets James Albert Okausa Graniosa, who is basically on a book tour. And there's just a little cryptic note in Newton's diary where he says, I was shy in meeting him. So it's really interesting, isn't it? He's already kind of an evangelical, well, Craig would say he's like an evangelical rock star at this point. Like he's written stuff, and he is apprehensive about meeting James Albert Okawasa Graniasa, and he ends up saying, like, he was like a warm greeting. He was a brother, and he spoke at the Great House at this meeting in Olney. So we thought, okay, that's the perfect point to basically take James Albert's own words and his testimony and have him be telling that story at the Great House. So it was an opportunity for us to allow him to speak in his own proper person. And there was sort of a point of entry there for that. So some of those were problems, challenges to try to sort of overcome. I think we also wanted Princess Pi on Plantain Island, who was princess of the Sherbro people and who is running the slave factory, as they call it, the kind of trading post for slaves where John Newton worked for a period. We narrated a little section from her point of view, because again, we wanted that sense of agency. And there's a little bit more to reconstruct sort of her story. But we felt it was important, even though it was very, very complex, because these little factories or forts were only maintained by leave of the African powers that many states and so on that are in the region. And there's various of these along the coast. And she is a slave trader, but to narrate what is black over white slavery, as John Newton is enslaved by her, in the context of a white over black slave system. Anyways, that's kind of complex to do, and to try to do it in a way that allowed her to be a genuine princess of the Bullen people and so on. So it involved doing a certain amount of ethnography of the Sherbro peoples and so on. Yeah.
If I can ask another question, Bruce. You know, I'm always interested in the women in these stories.
Pardon me?
You know, I'm always interested in the women in these stories. Do letters from Mary survive? Mary?
Very, very little at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what about manuscripts related to Princess Pi?
Very little related at all. Most of what we have comes from Newton himself and some of the earlier, we have some ethnography on the Sherbro peoples, and Tucker, descendant of the Tucker family, sort of mixed race family who are very influential in the region. There is a descendant who is involved in the civil service in Sierra Leone, who's written a very good ethnography of the Sherbro peoples. And a lot of that's helpful to sort of, in a sense, reconstruct that, but we don't have anything of hers. Yeah, have to reconstruct it.
Yeah, thanks. Chelsea.
As a fellow lover of footnotes and who has learned to do footnotes from you in the style that you like them, what did you do to help people, what have you done to help people who want to follow the story?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. There is sort of for further reading, but also we have a section at the end of detailed notes, which I did in a narrative form. So to be able to so that all this, I went through the chapters and tried to reconstruct in narrative form all the sources that kind of underlie what's going on, which is partly for further reading and just partly for people to know. And it narrates a little bit. Here we quite closely followed these sources, and here we reconstruct this dialogue based on this. So to give people, you know, the best kind of indication both of where this came from, but also what they can read. Yeah.
And I think we're going to call this the last question, Kaylee.
Oh, fantastic. Hope it's a good one.
No pressure.
I'm just so fascinated by the whole idea of the process of reconstructing dialogue to write a history. And it reminds me of a lot of kind of the Roman histories and a lot of ancient history and how ancient history was written. And so I wonder if you, as a historian, what you learned about history writing, or if you had any major insights about what it means to have reconstructed kind of history behind closed doors.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a tendency for academic historians just to be kind of snobby about anything that is popular history or it's, you know, that didn't really happen, or that sort of thing. And I might have had some of that sort of going into this. But I think what I discovered, I had a conversion, very appropriate, to realize that the arts, historical in this kind of domain, demanded more, not less, of me as a historian. Like on the first page, Craig is writing about the young John Newton doing up the buckles, joining his breeches to his yellow stockings. And I'm going, great. Now I have to know whether in 1742 there's buckles that join breeches to stockings. And I have to, but I realized I had not fully imagined my subjects in their moment. This happened again and again working with Ruben on the film, we'll talk about, but you know, I learned a lot about wigs. I learned a lot about, like, you know, I'd be in the middle of a meeting in San Antonio, an academic meeting, and I'm getting an email from production like, would the sailors be wearing wigs in the middle of a storm? And I'm going, bob wigs, not tie wigs, and for sure the captain, at this point, not necessarily the crew, you know? And, but I'm realizing, like, I have to fully imagine, you know, actually there were points at which, because of the demands of the genre, I realized the hole in the ship is on the right hand, it's on the starboard bow side of the ship. That's where it sustained the damage, because they're trying to keep that out of the water and it's putting them off course to the north. So by actually trying to see it, I'm actually, never mind feeling it, what is it like to be a 6-year-old boy and lose your mother and when your father's away at sea and to feel that? But I feel all of this has made me rethink. It's almost like we've talked a lot about Ignatian spirituality, and it's almost Ignatian where you're, like when you're reading the Gospels, can you see it? Can you hear it? Can you feel what's happening in that passage, right? This is like that as a historian. Like, can you actually see it, or are you hovering in midair somewhere? Remember, Ruben, when I asked you, can you please just ask me something about his Calvinism? You know? And going, no, you know? Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody, and Bruce. For those of you who are joining us online, thank you for being here. We're going to turn off the live stream now. But for those of you who are in person, don't go anywhere.